All right, welcome everybody. I appreciate people being patient on this because we actually had postponed this workshop a couple of times. Spring just gets to be a very busy time for us here, and I just appreciate people being patient about it. And hopefully, this will be very helpful. I will tell you right now, weeds are probably one of the biggest topics I hear about from gardeners all the time because everyone has to deal with weeds. It's not like I know of anybody who has a garden who doesn't have weeds. So it's also actually probably one of the biggest challenges for the garden. Uh, in fact, the failure to actually control weeds is probably the major cause of failure. Why, especially new gardeners, why they fail with a garden is because of weeds. Weeds get out of hand. Weeds happen. And if you can control them successfully, then you're much more likely to have a successful garden. I would say much more than bugs, much more than fertilizer, all kinds of things, all these other factors, weeds are probably the biggest. So if you can learn about them, learn about their life cycles, learn about how to control them, there's different ways to do that. There's easy ways and there's hard ways. And it's just really, really good to learn all this at some point. And um, today we're going to actually talk about, of course, a little bit of background about weeds. And then we'll talk about the different kinds of weeds, different types, different categories. And then we'll talk about the different methods of weed control, different types of weed control. And then at the end, we'll talk about individual weeds that you're likely to encounter here in your gardens, just so you can become familiar with them. All right, let's talk about a definition. It's always good to think about definition of what something is. A weed basically is a plant growing where you don't want it, or sometimes I'll hear people say a plant out of place. So it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily a good plant. Sometimes there's a good plant, like sometimes you might actually have little tomato seedlings coming up in your garden, but that's not where you want tomatoes this year. That's where you're planting your beans, in which case the tomatoes would be a weed because it's growing in a place you don't want it. Anyhow, every garden does have weeds. I've yet to see a garden that doesn't have weeds at some point. Some easy to control, some very hard to control. Some of the weeds, especially some of the annuals, literally produce thousands of seeds. I mean, one plant can produce thousands of seeds. Some weeds spread by underground runners, which are just really difficult to deal with. And then there's actually some weeds that have some benefits. I say benefits, usually that means edible. Some weeds are edible. Not all weeds that are edible taste good necessarily, but some are actually very tasty. And the thing to remember overall is it's always generally easier to control weeds sooner rather than later, regardless of what kind of weed it is. If you deal with them while they're small, even though you have a whole bunch of them, it's so much easier than when they get big. And eventually they get bigger and it's harder to deal with it. And eventually it gets so big that you think you can't do it. And that's when people give up. So a little more on the definition, actually looking at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is kind of fun. I'm a dictionary person. I love to look at words. Just gives you a little more insight. So they're saying a weed is a plant that is not valued where it's growing, and it's usually a vigorous growth. And it also says especially one that tends to overgrow or choke out more desirable plants. So it's not that just weeds are, kind of innocuous little plants that don't cause much trouble. A lot of them get really vigorous and take over, and they will choke out the plants that you want to grow. If you're looking at this picture right here, this is the same type of plant in the previous slide. This little tiny weed here is lamb's quarters, one on the top picture, and that is a very small weed at that point. But in just a few weeks, it can get like this. And this isn't even full grown. It gets larger than that. That's probably about half of its full size. And now there's many of them. So they can grow very thick and very fast and take over. So that's why weeds can be such a problem. All right, so yeah, but here's more reasons why weeds are a problem, a little more detail on that. Because they compete with your garden crops, the plants that you try to grow. So, you know, in your garden, you have so much space. If the weeds are taking up part of that space, that means the other plants can't grow. They also compete with your plants for sunlight. They'll start shading them, which means your crops that you want to grow, the smaller ones, are getting shaded out. They're not getting the sunlight, so they can't grow properly. And even water, they will compete with your crops for water. They'll take the water, and your crops won't get enough water to grow and nutrients. So all these things, but they also take your time. So if you let your weeds get out of hand, it's going to take up much more of your time, and you've only got so much time for gardening. So do you really want to spend it all on weeds? No, you'd rather do it taking care of the plants that you wanted to take care of, and harvesting and just watching them and all those kinds of things. And then there's some other problems which are caused by weeds or exacerbated by weeds. If you let your weeds get really tall, like in this picture here, in your garden or outside of your garden, you're going to have a lot more problem with grasshoppers, because grasshoppers love weedy conditions like this. If things are short and neat and tidier, there's not as much food available for grasshoppers. They're not as likely to come in and take over. Also, if you're afraid of snakes, this is like ideal snake habitat. You know, they love weedy areas. Also, you can't see them. And then everybody's favorite chiggers, which are little small creatures that, you know, can bite you, especially around your ankles and things like that when you're in weeds. If you can keep weeds down, you'll have much less problem with chiggers when you're out in your garden. So lots of good reasons to make sure that you keep your gardens free of weeds, so that your plants can grow properly. In this picture, it's kind of interesting. This looks like it's all weeds, but if you'll look right here, these are actually carrots trying to grow. And there's probably other carrots and other crops growing inside here. So this is somebody's garden which totally got out of hand, which we know that can happen. It's happened to almost all of us at some point. All right, let's talk about two different kinds of weeds, the two main categories, annuals and perennials. Just like with flowers, there's annual flowers and perennial flowers. Sort of the same idea. So annual weeds, basically, they complete their life cycle in 1 year. Sometimes that includes the winter time, like they'll start in the fall and finish up the next spring. So generally, though, they're not winter hardy, except for the ones that are called winter annuals. We'll talk about some of those after a little bit. So they don't come back from their roots. Lots of times people say, oh, if you don't get the plant out by its root, it will just come back. And that's not necessarily true with annual weeds, because they don't come back necessarily from their roots. But individual plants can produce many, many seeds. I talked about thousands potentially of seeds. And so it's very important when you are removing them, if they have seed heads on them, not to scatter those seeds around, not to put those seeds in your compost bin, and also just to try and remove the weeds before they produce their seeds. But generally, comparatively speaking, annual weeds are fairly easy to pull and, you know, fairly easy to hoe when they're small, so not as difficult. Perennial weeds, on the other hand, are a little more difficult. So they are winter hardy. They go over the winter. They can be either herbaceous or woody, and all that means is, you know, woody weeds would be things like trees and shrubs that actually have hard wood in their stems. Things that are not woody, you know, things like dandelions or grasses or ragweed, all these typical plants like that are called herbaceous, meaning they are not woody. And so they can live over the winter, all these perennial weeds. They'll come back the following year. Often they will spread by underground root systems, but not always. Sometimes they spread mainly by seeds, sometimes both. but they usually can regrow from the roots. So like if you break off the top of a perennial weed, like a fine weed or a dandelion, it's going to just grow right back. So you really have to work at trying to get those roots out. And it's usually kind of difficult to get those roots out. Sometimes they spread really far, they're deep. And so it's going to be a process. And some of the perennial weeds, we'll talk about them, are extremely aggressive and can be very difficult to control, to get rid of. And so we'll talk about that. We will be talking about which ones are easier to deal with, which ones are harder. Those are your two main categories of weeds. And so a little outline here on the methods of weed control. So the first one we'll be talking about is chemical. And there's, synthetic chemicals, which are made in the laboratory, and there's natural chemicals, which come from plants. And then there's mechanical weed control, which includes things like hoeing and tilling and just pulling by hand, or even mowing or weed eating. And then mulching. I'm a big fan of mulching. We'll talk about how to use mulch to control weeds. And also you can actually use weed fabric or landscape fabric, or weed mat is called sometimes. And that's an option also. So these are all the different methods of weed control. We'll start out talking about chemical weed control, because this is actually one of the things that people think about first, especially beginning gardeners. They'll say, oh, why not just use a weed killer in your garden? Well, unfortunately, most weed killers will also kill your plants, so it's not a good idea. So weed killers, I can't really say I recommend them ever for general garden purposes. There might be a time when, I don't know, you're starting with a plot of ground that is so bad you need to kill weeds off before you can even start. And sometimes that is the case. But in general, in the garden, once the garden's going, you're not going to be using weed killers. The synthetic ones, again, they're made in the lab. There's lots of potential health hazards. They're some pretty strong chemicals. I mean, if you go to the garden center, you'll see just a huge array. Look at this shelf here. It's filled with all different kinds of weed killers. So that can be kind of overwhelming. We're going to talk about them, some of the major ones today, just to give you a little background so you'll know about them and you'll be able to make good decisions on when you would use them and what sorts of situations you might use them. But generally not for use in the vegetable garden. And then natural chemicals, even though they're made from plants, they can kill your garden crops also, so you have to be careful. They're not as dangerous for you, and in some cases they aren't as effective, but we'll talk about those. And then the other thing you'll hear a lot about when dealing with weed killers, and I forgot to mention, the other name for weed killer is herbicide. Often you'll hear people talking about herbicides and using herbicides. That just means using a chemical that is to kill weeds. It's generally dividing herbicides and weed killers into two categories: pre-emergent and post-emergent. Pre-emergent just means a type of chemical that actually stops weeds from happening. It stops the seeds from sprouting. So you actually have to put that down before the weeds start growing, when you have bare ground. And so lots of times you'll hear about people using a pre-emergent on their lawn, and that's just to stop all the seeds, weed seeds, from germinating in their grass. Post-emergent weed killers refer to when the seed is already sprouted, it's already starting to grow. How do you kill it then? So that's what post-emergent weed killers are for. Let's talk about a synthetic chemical weed killer that is a pre-emergent. This is the most common one. The actual chemical name for it is Dacthal, but what you'll usually see is this brand name here called Preen, and it's very common. And people use it a lot on their turf. What it does, it stops the seeds from germinating. So you would never want to use this when your vegetable plants or you're getting ready to put seeds down, because it would stop your vegetable seeds from germinating. You have to use it with like plants that were already established, like tomato plants or pepper plants or something like that. Absolutely will not kill any weeds that are already growing. And then there is the potential for carryover. If you put too much down, not only will it stop seeds from germinating this year, it could stop seeds from germinating next year, which would be a problem if you're going to plant some seeds in that place, same place next year. The post-emergent synthetic chemical weed killer that you hear the most about is something called Roundup, or glyphosate is the scientific chemical name for it. Roundup has been a lot in the news lately because they found out a lot about health hazards, and especially for people who would spray it on a large, long scale, long-term period if you're using it a lot. So it's really not a great chemical to be using. It can be useful if you have some really, really difficult perennial weeds which you can't get under control. Other ways, Roundup can be used on those, but still you have to be very cautious and careful wearing protective clothing, etc. But it's non-selective. It will kill any kind of plant it comes in contact. So if you sprayed this in your garden trying to kill weeds, it could real easily drift onto the plants that you don't want to kill, your vegetable crops. It could also drift onto your flowers. You should never want to spray this on a windy day because it could blow over to your neighbor's yard and kill their plants. There's been cases of lawsuits where people will end up suing their neighbors because they sprayed some kind of a herbicide and it came over to their property because they weren't doing it properly. The one good thing about regular Roundup is it's fairly short-term persistence in the environment. It doesn't last for a long time. Some of the other post-emergent synthetic chemical weed killers last for a long time and have a long-term carryover. There are some different formulations for Roundup. Like the one in the main picture here, this picture here is just regular straight Roundup. This thing down here is called Extreme Roundup, or extended release Roundup or whatever, and it's got another herbicide added to it that lasts longer and is more dangerous and has more persistence. So you just want to be careful if you are going to use Roundup. You would want to use just the basic Roundup because it doesn't last as long in the environment. And again, some weeds which are really difficult to deal with, like Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, they may require more than one treatment. You might have to do it twice or even 3 times before you can totally get rid of it. Another very popular weed killer that you'll see at the garden centers is something called 2,4-D. That's the scientific chemical name. Trimec is a common name. There's other generic versions of this. And this basically is only for lawns, not for vegetable gardens whatsoever. It's non-selective, will kill any broadleaf plant, anything that's not a grass. That's why it works okay with lawns. Anything that comes in contact, and it will also drift. And it's kind of interesting, tomatoes are especially sensitive to the drift. And it's not unusual. I'll have people call me up over the years saying something's wrong with the tomatoes. The leaves are all wrinkly, it's distorted. If you'll look at that online, images of that, you'll see that. And basically that's typically caused by next door neighbors getting their lawn sprayed with 2,4-D to control weeds, and it drifts over and lands on the tomato plants, and just sometimes it'll actually kill the tomato plants, other times it just ruins the leaves and kind of wrinkles them up and makes them look really strange. Also, of course, a very big health hazard whenever people spray stuff like this, and it does persist longer in the environment. So again, this is for lawns only, and I don't even recommend it for lawns. I personally would not use this ever, and would not use it ever on a lawn or a garden or anything. So just warning you to be careful out there when you're buying things for your lawn. And then there's another post-emergent synthetic chemical weed killer that's worth mentioning. Scientific chemical name is Picloram, but the brand name that you'll usually see is called Tordon. This is a brush killer. Just your regular other weed killers don't work on woody plants like, little trees and shrubs and vines like poison ivy, things like that. So this is a brush killer, especially used to kill small weed trees. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The one thing that's a little bit different about this is you don't want to spray this. Spraying it won't be effective. It's like if you have a small tree that's growing up in your fence line and you don't want it to come back, you can cut it off and then use a paintbrush with this chemical just to brush onto the fresh open cut, and that will kill that tree so it won't sprout back on you. So the fact that you're using a paintbrush rather than a sprayer and blowing it around is much safer than some weed killers. You still want to be very careful if you get it on other things, any kind of vegetable crops, it will kill it. So don't want to do that. There is, of course, always with any kind of synthetic chemicals, there's health hazard potential and also long-term persistence in the environment. But this one is specifically for woody plants. All right, let's talk about a couple of natural chemical weed killers. And of course, that sounds like a much better idea, and I would agree. Definitely safer, not going to be as dangerous to the environment, not going to be as dangerous to you or pets or whatever. So let's talk about this one. This is called, it's a pre-emergent natural weed killer, which means it will prevent weeds from sprouting. And that company that I talked about before, the brand name called Preen, they actually make a version of this now that's specifically for vegetable gardens. Again, you still don't want to put it down anywhere where you're going to plant seeds. This is made from corn gluten, which is a grain product. When they mill the corn, like when they're making your cornflakes or whatever, this is part of what's left over. So again, you don't want to use this when you're planting your vegetable seeds, but if you're putting down tomato plants, you could put it down around that, and that would keep the weeds down. Again, if you spill too much or use it too much, you could carry over to the next year, which can be a problem. But the other interesting thing about this is it's also a fertilizer. It's a natural organic fertilizer that's high in nitrogen. It's about 10% nitrogen. So if you're using this, it can also give you a nice fertilizer boost, and you would not need to use an extra fertilizer with it. So it's kind of interesting. It's been around for, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years, but it's becoming a little more available now at garden centers, and there's different brands of it. Here's another natural chemical weed killer. This is commercial grade vinegar. You'll hear a lot about this on the internet. People say, oh yeah, you can just take vinegar from your kitchen and go out and spray it, and it will kill weeds in your sidewalk or whatever. And it's not generally that easy, because the kitchen vinegar that you use is 5% acidity strength. So if you're going to actually use it for killing weeds, you want to use the commercial grade, which is stronger. This is 20% acidity, which is much 4 times as strong as regular vinegar. And so this will actually kill weeds. It also is non-selective. So if you spray it on anywhere near vegetables, it will kill them as well. It's not effective on perennial plants that can regrow from the roots. So little annual weeds, it's fine. Things like the lamb's quarters, pigweed, ragweed, all that kind of stuff, crabgrass, it will kill them. It's a natural product, vinegar, so it's short-term persistence in the environment. Again, I don't really recommend it for vegetable gardens because it's just too easy to spray on other things. There's just a whole lot of easier ways to get rid of weeds. I'll tell you where we do use this. We use it in the floor on our greenhouse where we have gravel. Sometimes weeds will grow up there. We also use it sometimes on our brick path, just because you have bricks, and little weeds will grow up in the cracks in between the bricks. And if you put this down, spray it while they're very small, it kills them, and it's a good, easy way to control that. That's the type of place where you'd want to use something like this, not in your vegetable garden. So again, weed killers, not the answer. I don't really recommend using any weed killers, natural or synthetic, in your garden. There's just easier ways to do it, and we'll talk about that here coming up. So yeah, mechanical weed control, sometimes called physical weed control, because it's not like a chemical agent. you're doing something physical, you're using something mechanical like a hoe or a rototiller. So let's talk about using a hoe. A lot of people have used garden hose. There's many different kinds, different shapes. I mean, here's just a few of them in this picture right here. There's many, many different kinds. The technique for hoe is not so much that you're chopping the weeds. Unfortunately, sometimes people end up chopping because they wait and let the weeds get too big and they're trying to chop them out. The best technique for using hoe is when the weeds are just starting to sprout, very, very small seedlings, like an inch or so tall, maybe 2 inches at the most. And what you're doing is you're slicing the upper layer of soil. You're just kind of pulling it through the top. In fact, there's a couple of hoes that I really like for this purpose. This one here, this picture here is called a swan neck hoe. And you see the kind of curve so that when you're holding it, it's actually almost parallel to the ground. And so you insert it into the ground and you're pulling it back towards you and it's just slicing that top inch layer of soil. And that is the perfect stage to get many, many of those small annual weeds. And it just pulls them out real easy. There's no hand pulling involved. It's just easy to do. The one on the right is called a stuffle hoe. Got this triangular shaped thing. It's sharp on all sides. So you can just, get it under the soil by an inch and you can push it and pull it and go sideways and everything. And it will just do the same thing, which slices off those little annual weeds, seedlings that are starting to sprout. The whole idea is to do it preventatively before the weeds get very big. And this kind of hoeing works best when it's proper moisture condition, just slightly moist, not sticky. You don't want it to be muddy because it'll stick to your hoe. But, soon after a rain, sometimes it's a day or two, the soil is really nice and crumbly. That's the best time for tilling also. But when the soil crumbles, but it's still moist, is the best time for actually using a hoe and most other kinds of weed control. It's just easier to pull them, easier to till, when the soil is moist, but you don't want it to be muddy. So yeah, there is a process of what they call just cultivation, in which you're actually breaking up the crust of the ground when seeds are just starting to germinate, or even just as they're in the process of just germinating, and that disrupts their life cycle. All right, so let's talk about another mechanical, physical method of weed control is actually using a rototiller. So what this requires is that you have wide paths in between. Basically farmers, have rows like this, sometimes called row farming, or in this case, it's row gardening, where you have a wide path. The downside is it's not very efficient use of space, especially in smaller gardens, because the rototiller, even though there's some smaller ones, very tiny ones, which are only about 12 inches wide, and that works better in a smaller garden. But your regular average size rototiller is, at least 18 to 24 inches wide. So that means after every row of crop, you're going to have a wide path, so you can walk down in between it. But that also means there's going to be a big space there for weeds. So anyhow, if you are going to do a big garden, have lots of space, and have wide rows like this, you can make sure you plant your rows far enough apart to get the rototiller down in between, and then you're going to till in between. You actually don't want to get it so close that it's going to be tearing up the roots of these plants. So you got to make it even wider than what you would think for the rototiller to fit. And you also don't want to till very deep. You really only want to till the top inch or two, because that's where the little weeds are germinating, and you don't want to get down to where the plants, the good plants, the crops, are sending out their roots, because you don't want to tear up their roots. So you need to till shallow. You need to do it when the weeds are very small. You can't wait until they're too large, because it'll just get all twisted up and tangled under the rototiller. And you don't ever want to do it when it's too wet, because the soil will form hard mud balls, clods, which are difficult for gardening. And so, at some point after a rain, the seeds will start germinating. The soil is nice and crumbly, but it's not muddy. that's the good time to use the rototiller. There's also kind of an older technology here. It's mechanical. It's called the wheel hoe. Sometimes it's called the high wheel push cultivator. Looks like kind of a little plow type thing. I've actually used these before. We have a couple of them here at the community gardens. If any of our group gardens ever want to try to borrow one, because they have a big garden, they could try it. Doesn't have a motor, not used as much as often. You still have to have a path, but the path doesn't have to be very wide because the width of this device is only about 12 inches. Again, you're cultivating shallow. You have to do it when the seedlings are very small, and you want to do it when that soil moisture level is just at the perfect stage. It's very crumbly because you're just pushing this thing through the garden. It's breaking up the crust of the ground, the top inch or two, and will disrupt all those seedlings. And sometimes with this and with hoeing, with this and rototilling, you still have to do a little hoeing or a little hand pulling, because sometimes there'll be a weed that's just growing up right close to your plant, and you can't get close enough with the tiller or the hoe or this wheel hoe thing. So you have to pull something by hand sometimes. So, all right. This is probably one of the mechanical, physical weed controls that most people are familiar with. It's where you pull weeds by hand. It can be very time consuming, can be physically challenging. This is what people hate doing. So that's why you want to pull weeds when, you want to control weeds when they're small, either by preventing them from starting by using mulch, which we'll talk about here in a minute, or just, hoeing them when they're very, very small. Once weeds get too big, they're hard to even hoe out, so they require pulling by hand. It's easiest to do this when the soil is moist, not muddy, not super soggy, but just kind of moist, so that when you pull the roots out, they pull out easily. They kind of slip out. Generally, you can put the weeds on a compost pile unless you have an invasive root system, like some of your perennials. We'll talk about those. But most of your annual weeds, you can just throw the whole weed on the compost pile, and will add to your compost. Gloves can be helpful, although sometimes I actually like not using gloves, because then I can feel the stalk better and I know just how much to pull. You'll learn, if you do it, over the years, you'll learn, how hard to pull without breaking it off. So you pull gently and you get it to come out all the way by the roots. Some people say they actually enjoy weeding. I don't know if they really enjoy it that much. What they really enjoy is just the fact that your garden is getting cleaned out and looks much better. I know that's the case for me. It is satisfying when a weed comes out nicely and you get them out and you get your garden bed all cleaned out and it looks really good. That's really where the joy of weeding comes from. But the physical part, it's much better to do it before it gets to this stage, because if you have very much of this to do, you'll get overwhelmed and you might give up on your garden. Here's some pictures on the internet. I just had to kind of laugh a little bit when I see them, because first of all, this is a really, really big garden. And these people out there in the first picture up here, they're bending over, which is really bad for your back. You can't do that for very long. It's really hard to bend over to pull weeds. It's much easier to crouch like they're doing here, but even that gets hard on your knees. Sometimes if I've got a lot of weeds to pull, I'll just sit down, or I'll have a little garden stool or something, because even that can be hard on your knees. But the other thing is, with this kind of a garden, I don't know why they're pulling these weeds by hand. This would be so easy to take a rototiller down between these wide rows and just till up, But I guess they just wanted to show what it looks like hand weeding in this picture. I don't know what's going on here, but definitely easier ways to weed than what they're doing. So there are times when the weeds totally get out of control, and you can't get them with the rototiller, you can't get them with the hoe. They're too tall, too thick. You can't pull them by hand. It would take you forever. So this is kind of the last resort. is to physically mow them down, run over it with the lawnmower. Even that can be kind of difficult if they're very tall. You can use a weed eater, like the person is doing here in this lower picture. They're just literally chopping it down with a weed eater. And you can also use what's called a weed whip. That's this little tool up in the right-hand corner here. You swing this and aim at the base of the weeds, and it will chop them, just cut them off. It doesn't pull them out, but it cuts them off. And so this doesn't kill the weeds, it doesn't remove them, but it stops their growth temporarily and prevents them from growing to seed. So you definitely want to, if your weeds are totally out of control, you don't want to just leave them, because they're going to grow up and eventually they'll flower, not like pretty flowers, just generally kind of green looking flowers that you can hardly see. And they'll make millions and millions of seeds. I mean, I'm talking about literally there could be millions of seeds if you have enough of them. And this can buy you time until you can till. So what I tell people is, cut it down with a weed eater, come back with the lawnmower maybe, and again, then you'll be able to till later. In fact, here's kind of the timeline for, well, we'll get to that. We'll come back to this later about how to rescue a garden that's gotten out of control. But let's talk about probably the best and easiest method of weed control, and that's mulching. Mulching is where you take some organic matter like straw, could be leaves, dried leaves, and grass clippings, and put that down on the bare soil to help control the weeds. So here's the benefits of mulching. Obviously, it can suppress the weeds, but it also will cool the soil, because bare soil gets very hot. Bare soil dries out really quick. So it conserves the soil moisture when you put the mulch down, and also prevents rain compaction. If you just have bare soil and your soil's been all tilled nicely, the rain pours down on it and it packs it hard and makes it hard like cement almost. The other thing is you can use your mulch to add organic matter. At the end of the year, you can till it in, and that will add organic matter to your soil, just like adding compost. But also the mulch provides a good environment for soil microbes, all the little microscopic organisms like bacteria, fungi, small little animals, protozoas, different organisms that are part of the soil life that help the soil chemical to happen, help plants grow, help plants take up fertilizer, all that kind of good stuff. You need soil microbes and things like worms even, just do much better under mulch. So it's a really good idea. I started mulching the very first year I had a garden when I was 12 years old, because we had grass clippings, and that's what I used to mulch my garden. We'll talk about that here in a minute. So yeah, the big question is, what do you use for mulch? There's straw is very popular. We do a lot of that here at community gardens. A lot of our community garden groups will use straw, school gardens also. Lawn clippings from grass that has not been sprayed with synthetic chemicals. If you're going to buy something in the bag, there's a product called Cotton Burr Compost. I like that. It's shredded, looks kind of like peat moss. Again, you can also use the weed fabric. We'll talk about that in a minute. Some people will also use shredded leaves. If they're not shredded, sometimes leaves will blow away, but shredded leaves can make a nice mulch too. Often I get people asking about wood chips. There's lots of easy ways to get wood chips these days. I am not a fan of wood chip mulch in the vegetable garden. Maybe around trees and shrubs, that's a little bit different thing. In the vegetable garden, because at some point you'll want to till your mulch in, and if you till wood chips in, it can contribute to nitrogen deficiency, because the microbes that break down the wood chips tie up all the nitrogen in the soil. Also, you can get splinters when you're trying to weed in the mulch if you use wood chips. And also you can attract termites, which is not a good idea. you know, for if you got any buildings like sheds or your house is nearby, you do not want to be attracting termites to areas where they might damage your buildings. I also don't recommend using rubber mulch. They use that sometimes on playgrounds. The rubber mulch is like shredded tire material. There's some toxicity questions there, but also it doesn't break down and add to the soil or organic matter level. So just kind of not good for vegetable gardens. As far as when, I don't necessarily put it on right away because I'm waiting for the soil in the early spring to warm up. And sometimes having too much mulch down early will contribute to the slug population, which can be a problem, you know, for your garden. But you don't want to wait too long. As soon as the plants start growing a little bit and get big enough, you can put the mulch down. And usually I recommend like 2 inches, you know, and then maybe I'll add a little more later, especially with grass clippings, it will shrink down a little bit. And then again, you can till it at the end of the year. Some people like to keep it around year round. I do want to talk a little bit about grass clippings just because I am a huge fan of this as a mulch. I have a big yard and I catch the grass and I use the clippings on my garden. I use it on the paths in between my raised beds. I use it around my plants. You know, just put it in the wheelbarrow and, you know, spread it out. It's excellent mulch. It actually adds some nitrogen to your soil because of all the nitrogen in the green grass. I like it because it's so easy to fit around little tiny plants. You know, straw is a little coarse, and sometimes it's hard to, you know, work in around the small stalks and leaves. So you have to wait till the plants get bigger. But real easy to do, and then it dries to a nice light color, which I think is attractive. You do want to use it quickly because it will start to compost. You know, if you've ever just had a pile of green grass clippings, starts composting and heating up. Especially if you put it in a black plastic trash bag, it will get really hot and stinky, and the odor can be overpowering. So don't want to keep it there. It's better just to use it right away and put it around your plants. The other thing is it's free. I mean, straw costs money. You know, other mulches, you know, the copper compost costs money. So this is something that's free that you can produce yourself. There is a case to be made for year-round mulching. Basically, whenever you have any kind of bare ground, weeds are going to start to grow. Even over the winter, you'll get some winter annuals starting to happen. So I recommend keeping the ground covered year-round. So in the spring, that's when you might be tilling or spading up your soil. So at that point, you do want to rake back the mulch, pull it off. You can save it for later, but that way you want to allow your soil to dry out so you can do your tilling or your forking or whatever you're going to do. And then, of course, at the end of the year, if you're thinking about tilling your mulch in, you can go ahead and do that in the fall when it's dry enough for tilling. And then you can add a new layer of mulch over the winter just to keep the weed, you know, growth down from winter annuals like henbit and chickweed. So keeping the mulch on over the winter is a fine idea. It also helps to avoid erosion and compaction. So lots of good reasons for having year-round mulch. So out of all those methods, we talked about chemical control of weeds, we talked about mechanical control of weeds, pulling and tilling, and mulch. I much prefer using the mulch method. It's so much easier. It's preventative. It stops the weeds from getting started. It smothers them out, the little seeds as they're starting to germinate. And, you know, I still have to pull a few. I still do some hoeing, you know, as needed, but it cuts it down significantly. Let me talk a little bit about the weed mat, sometimes called landscape fabric, or even just weed fabric. This is becoming somewhat popular. People put it around their shrubs to keep the weeds down, and then put decorative gravel or bark on top. But you can also use this in the vegetable garden. It's black plastic. It's not the same as like fabric black sheeting, like polyethylene black plastic. because it lets water through. It's porous. It's a woven sort of plastic fabric. It does last, it's reusable. It will let the water through, which the plastic sheeting does not let water through. Also lets the air through, which is important because roots need air. Again, it's reusable. There is a commercial grade that you can buy. It's hard to find sometimes. It's thicker and heavier, lasts longer, is a better job of keeping out the weeds. Some people will actually make holes in this to plant their vegetable plants. Sometimes people will cut that with the scissors, or they'll actually use a burning flame type thing to just, it melts a little hole in it. So here in the upper picture, you can see people been planting squash. Works really well with big plants like squash and tomato plants, sweet potatoes, things like that. Does not work as well with tiny seedlings that you plant close together, do lots of thinning like lettuce or carrots and things like that. So if you want, you can put straw on top of it. That'll help the soil stay cooler, because that black plastic, even though it lets air through, can heat up significantly. Again, it works better with the larger plants. At the end of the year, you want to roll up your weed mat, your fabric, and save it for the following year. All right, let's just talk a little bit about rescuing a garden space that's overgrown. Here you can see a raised bed that is really, really overgrown with a bunch of different weeds, and it just looks kind of overwhelming. What are you going to do about that? So generally, I tell people just cut down the tall weeds. You know, you can use that weed whip if you got a weed eater. If you're able to, cut it down enough to where you can get the lawnmower to run over it. Sometimes you'll have really thick stalks, like on ragweed or lamb's quarters, that you can't cut with the weed whip, and you actually have to use like a pruning shears and just clip them off. What I like to do is clip them off, and leave about 12 inches. That then, if this is a raised bed, it allows me to have a nice handle to grab onto to try and pull the weed out after that. But it makes it less overwhelming to clip the tops off so you can get in there. In raised beds, after you cut down the weeds and then hopefully mowed them or whatever, or use the weed eater, in ground plots, you can till the soil when it's dry enough. In raised beds, then if you remove all that top growth, then you can rake it off and then spade it, or use a fork to turn it over and then rake it smoothly. And then after that, even if you're not going to plant right away, I recommend putting mulch down, a thick layer of mulch, so that new weeds don't start to grow and you'll have to do it all over again. Or you can put that weed fabric down. If you're not ready to plant, just put the weed fabric down and smother out any little weed seeds that are starting to sprout. And that way, it will not become a problem again. But, again, it can be pretty overwhelming. So it's much better not to let your garden get to this point, but to pull the weeds or control them mechanically, other ways, tilling, etc., before they get large and before it becomes this difficult. All right, now we're ready to talk about some specific types of weeds. We aren't going to spend a lot of time, except on a few of them, which are maybe a little more difficult than the others. Just a quick review: they complete their life cycle in a year. They're not winter hardy. They don't come back from the roots. They produce lots and lots of seeds. Generally, they're pretty easy to pull. Even though this garden here is overgrown with some weeds, I would still probably pull these out. These are lamb's quarters here. They pull pretty easy. This is ragweed. That pulls pretty easy, so not too difficult, really, even though it looks kind of overwhelming. Speaking of lamb's quarters, it's a very common weed. There you see it in the upper picture here. That's when it's small. Later on, it has a seed head on it. It's very common, produces lots of seeds, can get pretty tall, like up to 6 feet, maybe even 8 feet tall. Interesting thing is it's edible, and not only is it edible, it's actually tasty as a cooked green. Now, if you're going to use it at that stage, you want to for eating, you want to pick the young leaves and the very young tips of the plants, which is fine, because then you can just pull them out, get rid of them out of your garden. They saute up very nicely. It's almost like they look kind of like a ugly, strange looking weed until you put it into the skillet and saute it in oil, and it turns almost like spinach, and it's very tasty, very nutritious. Easy to control, except for the sheer numbers. If you let it get out of hand, they can get, very thick and will be overwhelming, but, easy to pull. Another annual weed is the pigweed. Um, Supposedly it can be toxic or potentially toxic to pigs and cows. So we don't normally have to worry about that too much. And actually for people, it's edible because these are actually species of amaranth. You've heard about amaranth grains, but amaranth is also edible green. So there's many different species, different kinds of pigweed. They grow really fast. They can grow pretty tall, like 6 to 8 feet tall. They're fairly easy to pull. They have this green flower stalk on it. It's going to produce lots and lots of seeds, thousands of seeds from one plant. And so you want to make sure to get these weeds out before that happens. Another weed you'll likely encounter is annual weed is the ragweed. There's a couple different kinds. The genus name is Ambrosia. The one on the top here is called the giant ragweed. It's got this kind of maple leaf shaped thing, and it gets really tall, like 6 to 8 feet tall, sometimes even 10 feet tall. The other one down here looks kind of like a ferny plant, almost like a marigold leaf or something. That's just the common ragweed, sometimes called the lesser ragweed. Does not get as tall, maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. Again, produces many, many seeds, but ragweed is also responsible for producing a lot of pollen that causes allergies, hay fever type stuff, symptoms in the late summer and early fall. So that's the big culprit. If you have allergies in the fall, yeah, it can be grass and other things, excuse me, but it's also pollen from the ragweed, which is just really, really dense, and it floats through the air literally for hundreds of miles. The leaves of ragweed are also kind of a skin irritant. It's not like poison ivy or anything, but it'll make you itch and scratch. Doesn't last very long, but can be annoying. Relatively easy to control this plant when it's small. It pulls out easy, and definitely want to do that before it goes to seed. Oh, here's some pictures of the ragweed flowers here up close. Again, not attractive, but just lets you know they're going to be producing seeds. So you want to stop them. And here's some giant ragweed just to give you an idea of how tall it can get and how thick and stuff. So it can get really big and large, and you can cut those down and pull them out. And you have to use a shovel, but it's definitely doable. Another annual weed is called henbit. It's a Lamium species. This one is the one I mentioned is a winter annual. So it starts sprouting in the fall, makes little tiny plants, and kind of grows slowly over the winter. If you have a warm spell, it might grow a little bit. But then when spring comes, it really starts to grow fast and get thick. And that's when it sends up its little flower stalks, which actually can be kind of pretty if you see a whole field of them, or once I saw a whole yard that was covered with henbit flowers and dandelion flowers. Very pretty for a couple of weeks, purple and yellow, but then it got overtaken, goes to seed, and obviously spreads more and just really gets out of control if you're trying to grow a nice lawn. Spreads by seeds, so you want to pull it, just as before it starts flowering and making seeds. And it's pretty easy to pull. It doesn't have a big root system, so it pulls out fairly easy. Another winter annual is chickweed. Obviously called that because chickens, like to eat it. It's a small leaf, and it's around during the time of year when they don't get much greenery. So again, it's a winter annual. It has a prostrate growth habit. It just kind of creeps along the ground, spreads by seeds, fairly easy to pull, really not a real difficult weed. Crabgrass is something that people deal with a lot in their lawns. It's very common. In lawns, it actually is a grass, So it's a little bit different from our other weeds we've been talking about. It's got a prostrate or procumbent growth habit. Just creeps along the ground. That can make it sort of hard to pull out sometimes, but really not too difficult. Spreads by seeds. In this, here you can see it growing in the bare garden soil here. Very familiar to most people. Here, it's actually growing in a raised bed that has been mulched. So probably what happened here is the layer of mulch is not very thick and the seeds started to germinate and they got through the mulch. But you'll see the mulch stopped most of the seeds. There's not very many, just a couple of little crabgrass that managed to get through the mulch. So makes it much easier to pull. And in fact, if they're moist underneath from the mulch, makes it easy to pull. So mulching, always a good idea. Green foxtail, another common annual, a little bit taller. It's kind of a coarse grass, very, very common in lawns, and just, empty spaces. Got the feathery flower heads, the foxtails, they call them. Easy to pull, especially when they're not too big, but easy to deal with. Does not have an underground system that spreads like other grasses. Excuse me. Purslane is a common annual weed, likes heat. It's got edible leaves and actually is fairly nutritious and very tasty. In fact, sometimes people will cultivate in their gardens on purpose. And in France, it's actually grown as a somewhat common vegetable. It's got this creeping prostrate growth habit. It's easy to pull out if you want to get rid of it. And you could eat it if you want to. It looks kind of like a succulent, almost like a little. The leaves are thick and succulent, almost like a little jade plant or something, but very easy to deal with. I also might mention sometimes you'll see purslane. There's special flowering versions of this you'll see at greenhouses for sale that have similar leaves. They're not quite the same, but it's also grown because they have attractive flowers. But the one that will be wild and growing as a weed in your garden will not look like that. So it'll look like this picture here. You'll hear this lots of times, plantain. That's not the type of plantain that's looks like kind of a green banana that you see in the grocery store. This is a weed. Many different kinds of plantains. They do have edible leaves. I've never tasted them. You have to cook them. So I'm not making any promises on how great it would be. Again, it's got this kind of creeping prostrate habit. This makes a little rosette, a little circle of leaves, fairly easy to pull. All right, now we're going to talk about perennial weeds. We're getting close to the end here. And again, just a little review on perennial weeds is they are winter hardy. They're going to go over the winter. They will come back. They can be either herbaceous, which means soft stems, or they can be hard stems with wood in them, like trees and shrubs and vines. Often the perennial weeds will spread by underground root systems. Sometimes they're called rhizomes. They usually can regrow from the roots if you break off the top. And it's difficult to pull them out completely, difficult to remove them. Sometimes you have to dig them out with a shovel to get most of the root system. And some of these, in fact, the first three we're going to talk about here, are extremely aggressive and can be very difficult to eradicate and make your gardening a real challenge. So we will talk about these terrible three here. The first one is Bermuda grass. It's a warm season grass that's actually used in lawns. If you go farther south, they use it in lawns quite a bit because it is so tough. Can take really dry weather, can take the heat. It makes a thick lawn, but it is a disaster getting into gardens, into shrub areas, vegetable gardens, flower gardens, because it will just take over. If it can find bare ground, it will take over. It does have underground rhizomes. In the bottom picture, you can see, this plant here, what it looks like, and it's got little roots. Everywhere there's a little leaf, it can root and just spread that way. It just creeps along the ground and takes over. Very difficult to control because you can't just pull it out very easy. Pull it out, and it will come back somewhat. You can throw mulch over the top of it. It will, poke right through the mulch. You can throw black plastic over it and landscape fabric and other things, and it will just eventually find its way out the sides or come out the top, make a hole in it or something. It's very, very difficult. This is one plant that if we see this growing a lot, like on an empty lot, and somebody wants to have a garden there, I tell them, you know what, you'd probably be better off finding another spot because you will be fighting this for the next 10 years. And if you don't give up. And so it's just really, really challenging and difficult. So this is one case, if you had some of this and you were trying to do a garden, that I would consider using Roundup, just because otherwise you won't ever have clear ground to garden in. It'll just always be there. So again, not recommending use of Roundup generally, but this might be a case where you might want to consider it. So beware of Bermuda grass and don't plant it as a lawn grass. Another real difficult grass is called Johnson grass. It's much taller grass. This is one that farmers have a lot of difficulty with. It gets tall. It's very aggressive. It spreads by underground rhizomes. If you'll look at the top picture here, you can see what the rhizome looks like. It's very thick and fleshy and just, spreads out, and, then you'll start another plant, spreads out again. Also can be spread by seeds. Here you see the seed heads. So if you do have Johnson grass, cut it down so it doesn't go to seed. Also, if you cut it down, because it is such a coarse grass, if you mow it very short, it will not be able to regrow easily, and you can weaken it significantly by doing that. So this picture below is in a farm field, so obviously that's a problem, but in your garden, it can be a problem too. Here's some pictures of Johnson grass in the garden. So here is a picture I showed earlier. It's got a bunch of annual weeds here, like lamb's quarters, some ragweed, some other stuff. Those are easy to pull, but this Johnson grass here growing on the edge will be difficult. If you just pull it, it's likely to break off and will just re-sprout again. And that's better than doing nothing because you don't want to go to seed. But in this case, you probably want to get a shovel out, like a garden spade of some kind, and actually dig it out and shake the dirt off the roots. And then you don't want to throw this in the compost pile. You want to throw it out in the trash or somewhere else where it's not going to be a problem. Because if you put it down and just drop it somewhere in the ground, it will start to grow again. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see some Johnson grass growing in the bed. And here again, you see some more growing in the bed. So obviously, you want to get rid of that. And if it's just a clump like that, you can, dig it out and shake the dirt off the roots and get it out. But if you have a lot of it, it can be a real difficult problem to deal with. The third member of this terrible 3 perennial weeds would be bindweed. It's a member of the morning glory family. In the morning, you'll see these little tiny white flowers about 1 inch in diameter. And you'll see that and you think, oh, this is a nice little ground cover. It's kind of pretty. Unfortunately, it's very aggressive and it's real difficult to control. Spreads by seeds. It drops seeds everywhere from these little flowers, and also has an underground root system. So if you just pull this plant off, it'll break off, and the roots will regrow and come back. So also, if you put down landscape fabric, it'll just keep crawling towards the edge and come out underneath the sides, and come up again. So it's just very difficult to eradicate. This is another case where some Roundup might be not a bad idea, but this one I feel like we can smother it out. And that's the thing with all 3 of these. If you don't allow them to grow very much, like I've seen the Bermuda grass pop up in the raised bed just a little bit. And if you break that off, pull it out, even if you don't get all the root right away, but don't allow it to have green leaves. Plants have to have green leaves in order to succeed. If you keep breaking them off just as they come out, it's going to weaken that plant and eventually it will die because it can't have leaves out in the sun to make, to photosynthesize. Plants have to do that in order to survive and generate food for the plant. So you just can't let it grow very long or they'll start to photosynthesize because they'll have green leaves that have been growing for a while and they'll rebuild the food storage system inside the plant. So dandelion is another very common perennial weed. People hate dandelions. In the garden, they're not so bad because basically you can just take a shovel and scoop it out, get that root, dig down as deep as you can. You want to stop them from going to seed. So, if they're in your lawn, which I have some in my lawn, I always try to mow before they go to seed because that otherwise will spread them everywhere. Because this is a wind-blown seed, it spreads, very rapidly just by blowing in the wind. And it's got this difficult taproot, which is difficult to get out. But you can take a shovel, a spade, and just dig it out, and then it should not grow back up. Another difficult one is this yellow nutsedge. Sometimes it's called nutgrass or watergrass. You'll see it in your lawn if you have areas where it stays wet longer. If you have a wet spot in your garden, it'll thrive there. It's real difficult to deal with because it has a little tuber, almost like, think of like a miniature potato that you don't see. It's actually edible, and in some countries they eat it. But if you pull on it, it'll just break off, and that tuber will still be underground. So if you really want to get rid of it in your garden, you'll have to dig down a little bit with like a trowel or something, and then pull it out from that and get out that little tuber. But if you keep pulling it, eventually it will be weakened. Now there are some chemical herbicides, but they are not the sort of thing you'd want to use in a vegetable garden. So that is definitely not recommended. Another perennial weed is called dock. There's many different kinds. The species, the genus name is Rumex. There's broadleaf dock, there's curly dock, there's some other docks. They produce lots of seeds. They don't spread so much by underground roots, but more by seeds. They have these brown seed heads. So at this point, they've already made seeds, but you can clip those off and get rid of them. So when fall comes, they don't just drop them everywhere and make a whole lot more weeds for next year. They're pretty deep rooted, but they're not too difficult to control because they don't have underground rhizomes that just spread like the Johnson grass. So not too difficult to deal with. Oops, wrong way. A couple more here. Perennial weeds, woody plants, honeysuckle. This is what they call the Tartarian honeysuckle. It's a shrub. If you go out in the woods anywhere in Missouri or even Kansas here, in this part of the country, and much of the country, this is a very invasive woody shrub that has taken over the woods. It sprouts up everywhere in the woods. You're driving along in parks and you see early in the spring, you'll see light green growing underneath the shaded trees. That would be the honeysuckle starting to start growing. Spread by seeds that come from berries that birds eat and spread them. The berries are not edible, or if they were edible, they're not tasty. But birds spread these everywhere. And it really is a problem with how thick they are, like in the wild woods areas of Missouri. So here in Swope Park, they actually have volunteer crews that come in and periodically chop out and dig out these shrubs because they're just difficult and they don't want to take over. They want to have some nice areas that are clear. But almost all wooded areas are just covered with this stuff. There's another honeysuckle that's a bad weed I'll make mention here. I don't have a picture of it right now, but it's called Hall's flowering honeysuckle. It's sometimes planted as an ornamental vine, Japanese honeysuckle. It does have a really great fragrance and spreads like crazy. It will climb up in other trees and shrubs and just take over, and it's a really, really invasive weed. Not too much a problem normally in the vegetable garden, but if you have wooded areas near your house, it can be a real bad pest. I just wanted you to be aware of those invasive pests. And a couple more. Lots of times trees will drop lots of seeds, things like maple trees, especially elm trees. And especially there's one called the Siberian elm, which is a very invasive. There's also the Callery pear, which is now becoming invasive. It's not really an edible pear, but an ornamental pear that people planted for the flowers. And now it's being spread all over the Missouri and Kansas and popping up in the woods and all kinds of places. But lots of times, in your garden, especially if you have a fence along there, you might have weeds, trees popping up. Sometimes elm trees could also be mulberry, maple, just different kinds of trees. Any kind of a tree that starts growing in your garden, even sometimes I'll get a walnut tree, you got to get rid of it because it's going to get big. I mean, really big, like 50 feet tall eventually, maybe 100 feet tall if nobody removes it. So they grow pretty fast and can get very tall. Here's some Siberian elm leaves, so you can just get familiar with what that looks like. And here's what the seedling looks like. And these have been pulled out because they've been dug out, but you can see how deep those root systems are. So lots of times people try to pull on them, they won't come, and they'll just break off, or they'll just try to dig down. They don't get very far. You have to take a pretty deep spade and dig down deep enough to get the root system. And last but not least, perennial weeds, woody plant, poison ivy. And this is the vine. People get into lots of the discussion of like poison oak and poison ivy. They're very closely related. They look very similar. It doesn't really matter. Most common though is the poison ivy. Of course, it gives people that terrible rash. And sometimes I have people say, oh, I don't get affected by it all. Generally, that means they don't get it very easily. Sometimes that changes as you get older, you become more susceptible. Sometimes they don't think they get it because they've just never been out in the woods that much. But it's caused by contact with the leaves or even just the bare stems. So if the leaves are off in the winter, you can brush up against the stem and still get poison ivy in the middle of winter. And what it is there's oil that's in the leaves, on the stems. And as you brush up against this plant, you get that oil on your skin and it sticks there. If you go home and wash right away with soap, because soap removes oil, and scrub with soap and hot water, you can remove that oil before it has effect on you. You got to do it soon though. You can't wait overnight and think you're going to be okay. So generally, if I've been out in the woods, I mean, I'm pretty careful. I know what poison ivy looks like. I always take a hot bath, use soap and water. It's just a good idea. Poison ivy also grows on the side of trees. So like if you're in the woods walking along, and you see a vine on a tree, just don't touch it. If you don't know what it is, it just has the 3 leaflets, which makes it fairly easy to identify. Here you can see the 3 leaflets. Here you can see the 3 leaflets. And here you can see it, 1, 2, 3. That lets you know that that's poison ivy, and just want to avoid that. So it also, though, for gardens, it can be a problem because it can grow in the grass and eventually creep into your garden. So if you don't mow your grass very often, sometimes you'll have poison ivy creeping up here in this picture on the middle right. You can see little bits of poison ivy creeping up. And so if you're mowing your grass pretty short regularly, you won't see that happen, which is good. But otherwise it can, and it can creep into your vegetable garden, and it's a problem. So anyhow, so those are the weeds. And now I'm ready to take questions. If Rob, were there questions that people sent in? Great. Again, just try to be proactive. Try to get the weeds when they're small. I really recommend mulch. If you've never tried it, at least try getting some straw, putting down a thick layer around your tomato plants or something. And if you don't think that makes life much better for you, I would be surprised. So really, mulch is the answer, but also learn how to use a good hoe and when's the best time to hoe and hoe properly. If they get out of hand, pull them by hand if you have to, but don't let them get so tall that you can't pull them by hand. And in the spring, we get busy with other things. I know for me personally, at community gardens, it's my very busy time of year. That's when my garden's likely to get overtaken by weeds. Once I get it under control, I'm getting caught up now, getting my mulch down, getting out, pulling out the weeds that got away from me. And then after that, putting mulch down, and it will really cut down on my weeding time so much over the rest of the summer. It makes it so much easier. All right, well, good luck to everyone. Happy gardening, and keep an eye out for your weeds. Again, this will be available. Rob will have it up next week. You can watch it, or you can tell friends about it, share it with them. And also, I just want to encourage you, if you haven't visited the community gardens, start by visiting our website. Lots of great resources on there. And also come visit here. Right now, our children's garden is open. You don't even have to have children. You can come look at it. It's open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and on Saturday mornings from 9 to 12. If you're just coming as an individual or individual family, there's no charge, and you can take your time. If you want to schedule a tour, like if you're with a youth group or a school group or a day camp or daycare, you want to call ahead and make a reservation so we can have a tour guide available for you. All right. Thank you, everybody.